As we cherish our country, Moma and Bomubine. If I'm Pibonta, it is send a bay a beconkai. That is a shiny proyena, Muma and Kitemu. Yamaman so my Tunkene, Muma and Kitemu. Shakome the Wunya Nasa will be a money be. What the Echo Many Wakasumo, and she what then she was she on there. Ejirawa, how a face again, and no man for or dancing Nanka, who went there. Love is what we stand for. Love has been our anchor. We show you so much hospitality, you come back for more.
Hello and welcome back to Afrikanists Assemble. This episode is about the question of interdisciplinarity. We asked our contributors if Afrikanistik, the study of African languages and literatures, were to merge or have more porous borders with another field. Which field do you think would be a cool partner and why? Let's find out what they answered.
Ilirimi ni minkarangani ya kuzaliwa shimaka kufunda. Lirimi ikutivisana, ni kukutivisana, ikuhanya utomu ni vangwana. Lirimi limalishwa kuishikota kutira ni vangwana, kuhita twisisana msava, kuhindlela lei, ikumantamsela. Loku hingali nasho leswi hingi ikufunda, ashingata pelanchumu, ikulirimi, ikukumantamsela. Nambi ugondzo wa utomu wa swihari ni wati na utamsava I swilo leswi swi ngo famba ni lirimi hikuva swi pfunaka ku phasa ni ku vumba misava na hi tirhisa lirimi swi tlhela swi pfuna ku paluxa ku tivisa hi laha swi pfunaka ku tivisana. Minkarhingani ya tsaliwa yi ni ntirho lowukulu ngopfu hi laha yi pfunaka vanhu lava va tirhaka ni timhaka ta ku susa ukolonyi nhlokweni ya hina. Mina leswaku susa ukolonyi a ni swi voni ku ve I ntirho wa ku nchusa nqondo ya hina a jamangweni ya miehleketo. Ku susa ukolonyi I ku ringisa ku vula swa ku kufunda I ku kamba mavulavuleli lawa ma nga kala ku ilintiyisi hi ku misava yi mafanela. I ku kamba misava leyi ya ku yi nga mahekaki kambe a yi mahekanga. Ku tsala ka swivumbiso ku hi rhamba ku hi vona misava hi ndlela yoleyo. A wu fundi la tirimi ta Afrika ni minkarhingano ya ku tsaliwa ku ni lisima hi mhaka leyi yi twalaka. Mayakeli ya tirimi leti ni milongoloko hi nga tolovelanga na wona hinkwaswo leswi swi sindzisa lava va nga kala va nga swi tolovelanga ku vona swa ku misaveni lomu va hanyaka kona hi lomu va nga ku tolovela. Ku pfumela leswaku tirimi ta Afrika ni minkarhingano ya ku tsaliwa ku hambanile ngopfu I nge vi ndlela leyi hi ngo to yi khoma hi ta tivonela la ka leswi hi nga swi tolovela. Na tshemba ku xa ku biha ngopfu ka mfundi I ku tshemba mavulavuleli lawa ma mu kombaka a misava a nga yi tolovela. Ku hi ta twisisa misava ku lava ku hi minkama hi vona ku nge a hi tivi. Leswi swi lava ku vula leswaku xivutiso xinene a xili hi mani a nga fanelaka ku a tirhisana ni udyondzi la tirimi ta Afrika. Hi nga mahisa ku yini ku vufundi un'wana wu pfumela ku yamukela udyondzi la tirimi ta Afrika ni minkarhingano ya ku tsaliwa ya kona. Ndzeni ka ufundisiwa ku kota ku vadyondzi va fuya mkhuva wa ku vona mchumu hi matihlo man'wana. Swa ntsakisa ku vula leswaku hi swoleswo munghana wa mina Mamadu Jawara wa xikolo xa le Frankfurt na mina hi mahaka ndzeni ka xiringisi xa bandla la ufundi la timhaka ta Afrika ni lava va ha li ku huma udokodolweni na hi pfuniwa hi nkomponi wa Gerda Henkel. Henhla ka mchumu yin'wana hi xinyata vadyondzi va hina ku tolovela ku hundzuluxa mavulavuleli ya udyondzi ya vona hi ririmi la vona va tlhela va ehlekanya ku makarhateli lawa ma lava ku vula yini loko hi lava ku yi twisisa a misava. No sungula nyamuntlha ku vulavula swa udyondzi hi ririmi la mina. Futsi a ni tshembi leswaku lava va khulumaka ririmi leri va ta swi kuma leswi ni nga vula. Kambe nghingiriko lowu wu komba ntumbuluxo lowu wu ni lisima linene ka ufundeni. ku sindzisa vanhu va nga tolovela ku nitwa na ni khuluma Xinghezi, Xijermani, Xifaransa ni Xiputukezi tibangeni ta vutivi. Va nitwa na ni khuluma ririmi la mina la ku hlamarisa. Ku nghena phakati ka swoleswi ni nge vufundi la tirimi ta Afrika li nga pfuna tidyondzo tin'wana ku ti tlhantlha ka vafundi va toho.
If the study of African languages and literatures were to be merged with another field, I would suggest the digital technology field would be a cool merger. The digital media is designed in such a way that African literatures and African creative expressions can be captured, processed, shared, and retrieved by many viewers or followers across the world, since the digital technology has turned the world into a global village. The digital technology is not transitory but has come to stay because it keeps evolving into new forms every day. Every day, different apps, social media handles, computer-generated imagery, and new forms of computer applications are created and are on the increase. Thus, this 21st century, in the words of Teju Cole, has ushered in new African digital natives. Aside literatures, which can be found on blogs and social media handles such as Facebook, oral literatures such as the proverb genre, in which Akin Alabi's 2D Nigerian proverb animation has generated followers on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. For those of us that have taught in the secondary schools, one would advise the use of video clips as good instructional material, especially in the teaching of poetry. Some of these examples of indigenous African oral expression give students insight as to what creativity is in African languages. These students can also be stimulated through the video clips to write and produce creative oral expressions in their own way, and with computer skills can upload their creativity online.
Afrikanistik or Afrikanistics always has been an utterly interdisciplinary field. The early scholars of African languages and literatures intensively cooperated with experts in racial science, as well as with archaeologists, anthropologists, historians, and so on in the colonial era. And this cooperation across disciplinary boundaries left behind an utterly problematic heritage, toxic collections, and unsolved problems in how we should deal with our problematic beginnings. We still continue to work in interdisciplinary contexts, cooperating with linguists from all kinds of fields, anthropologists, musicologists, experts in literature, and so on. And if you look at the biographies of some of the important Africanists or linguists working on African languages, you find that they have often received training in other disciplines as well, such as mathematics, for example. So the field is quite diverse, and people do not seem to care too much about boundaries to other disciplines. The only boundary that always has been seen as important and strict is that where ontological injustice comes into play. Africanists hardly ever cooperate on equal terms with local experts on language, with indigenous philosophers, indigenous theorists, and this is where boundaries should become porous, where they should even be removed, where things should become more normal in the sense of a utopian normal.
If Afrikanistik were to merge or have porous borders with another field, I would think that performing arts would be a cool partner. I know that African studies incorporate literary works of art, but I think a deliberate extension to fully accommodate performing arts, in particular music and dance, would not just add flavor, but it will constantly serve as a source of new knowledge to Afrikanistik. Music and dance are an integral aspect of African culture, which is deeply woven into the very fiber of the soul of the people across the ages. Music and dance serve various purposes in African context. I can't imagine African society without performing arts. Almost every occasion in Africa, formal and informal, calls for performing arts. Music and dance are creative and constantly evolve to encapsulate the past and present of African history, the daily experiences and lives of the people, their values and heritage, their woes and victories, their aspirations and hopelessness, their complexities and diversities, among others. Music and dance provide a window into the very essence of Africa and her people. An empirical experience of performing arts could produce more knowledge of greater significance in Afrikanistik than any other form of study. The dynamism that characterizes the production of new knowledge in performing arts in Africa could serve as a source of fresh ideas in Afrikanistik.
In my understanding, if Afrikanistik, or the study of African languages and literatures, were to be merged or have more porous borders with other fields, then the fields of sociology, philosophy, and history would be amazing partners. I mean, literary works cannot be isolated from their sociological context. Context matters, we always know. And context here mean every bit and pieces of information that is of interest to a sociologist. Now, if anyone is afraid of corrupting the creative effort with sociological reductionism, say qualitative data analysis, for example, then they should envisage a future in which an inclusion of sociology will take into account the nuances and dynamics of literature with its transcendental and timeless qualities, including, of course, the beauty aspect of language that sometimes we pay attention to when we do a literary study. And this combination will surely enable us to know more than what we know today at the moment. And of course, the study of African languages and literature enables us to know its finest expressions produced by African cultures. Now, these expressions that explain the people's identities, including their dreams, aspirations, struggles, and experiences, historicizing them will make their preservation better. And to preserve these as record of the past would mean that in the future we'll always have a past that we look upon to understand the present and to anticipate the future itself. What do I mean by this? I simply mean that history has a place or an important role to play in Afrikanistik. And finally, of course, literary works are constructions, are just constructions, imaginative constructions that enable everyday experience to run smoothly. And if you ask me what the difference between that and philosophy, I will ask you too, what do you mean? So I think philosophy will make an important partnership with study of African literature and languages.
In my opinion, there is a close affinity between Afrikanistik and the study of anthropology. This is because you cannot study African languages and literatures outside of the cultures from which they develop and from which they function. And therefore, the study of culture would enable us to understand the dynamics of languages and literatures in Africa.
I'm gonna go out on a bit of a limb here and actually say that Afrikanistik sollte sich ein bisschen mehr öffnen zu den Naturwissenschaften. Und zwar sage ich das eigentlich auch, weil mir das gerade total hilft, to look a bit into physics mostly and the philosophy behind physics, to actually think about things in a different way. Es gibt also Ressourcen da draußen, die sich außerhalb der Sozialwissenschaften and outside of linguistics damit beschäftigen, was eigentlich unsere wissenschaftlichen Messapparate, Measuring Apparatuses, tun. Also was eigentlich unsere wissenschaftlichen Praktiken sozusagen mit den Gegenständen machen, that we're looking at. And I think this is really interesting for linguistics because linguistics has also over the years built up a huge machinery of grammar categorizations, language categorizations, language associations with territories. All diese Apparate haben natürlich ja auch eine Kolonialgeschichte, vor allem im Zusammenhang mit der Afrikanistik und der Kolonialexpansion. And in this context, Mingqing Yuan inigisa umtla
ukufumana answers for how these apparatuses actually influence what we can see. And from my own experience, I can say that it sort of helps to have a theory in the background that actually can concretely show how the way we think about things, the way we write about things, and the way we structure things actually shape the things that we're dealing with. And we cannot actually see language and linguistics outside of these apparatuses unless we have tools that make those apparatuses themselves visible. And I think that actually physicists have thought about those things. Not all of them, but some. And yeah, so maybe how would that be? Sort of a very interdisciplinary, not just within the social sciences, but also outside. That would be a cool exploration for Afrikanistik, I think.
I thought of quite a few subjects with which Afrikanistik could have more porous borders. For example, with history, that's quite an obvious link, or with geography, especially in Africa, with the kind of arbitrary borders that we have that basically cut language groups in half. But then I was reminded of a very interesting article by a colleague who linked African languages and teaching in African languages to the study of astronomy. And this is, I think, he's Professor Lerotodi L. Liu. And he, for example, described the way in which the Botswana people look at the sky and the sense they make of the constellations that they see in the sky. For example, the Milky Way is also called the path above, and there is a link to an idiom in Setswana whereby the Milky Way is also linked to a woman's dress with many colorful patterns. And then there's the Orion constellation that is referred to as Dikko, which means pigs. And it is interesting, according to Professor Liu, that this constellation appears at the time when wild pigs are born. And so these stars represent then to the Botswana that particular time of year. And he has many more very interesting names, but I think why it is important is because it shows a different view of the sky and a different way of looking at stellar constellations. And maybe by taking those differences into account, we might get a different view of the sky, and we might be able to access knowledge that hasn't been accessible to us in English. So that's the kind of porous border I would like to see.
Well, firstly, I believe disciplines themselves are a product of modernity and therefore only partly suitable for a recalibrated field. 21st century problems can only be solved when working collaboratively across fields of expertise, epistemologies, and ontologies. Mignolo says, thinking decolonially de-links from thinking disciplinarily. And I think this is what we should be doing. Ask transdisciplinary questions and blur our disciplinary boundaries as far as possible. As we also see in AVA, this is happening already also on a more strategic level. For instance, sociolinguistics and the sociology of language open up to media studies, philosophy, art studies, literature studies, and so forth. Many argue that Afrikanistik has been part of interdisciplinary collaborations ever since. Yes, that's true, but the agenda was wrong. Language was manufactured and used as a tool to hierarchize and subordinate. But what do we do when we recognize this and still want to continue studying how people communicate and express themselves, but we cannot talk about languages any longer? We need to find new methods and registers. Perhaps we'll be inspired by our colleagues around the corner in the other aisle of the university. I think we can learn a lot from contemporary anthropology. Foremost, the thorough self-reflexive positioning, especially with regards to whiteness, is also crucial for Afrikanists, I believe. And of course, the foregrounding of qualitative ethnographic methods that acknowledge the temporality, relativity, and historicity of truth and evidence, but still enable us to say something about the world. The other discipline that survived despite and perhaps even because of and due to a constant reflexive and self-critical fundamental epistemological interrogation is science and technology studies. They show us how to carry forward a nexus orientation. That means to grasp phenomena within the many relationships and directions they move in.
What I particularly like about that line of inquiry is the interest in the agency of material objects. In our case, that could, for instance, be the heightened attention to the different effects of the technical materiality of text. And yes, we do that partially, but not yet as a rigorous standard. In a nutshell, I believe conscious identification with anti-positivist and qualitative approaches can carry us forward and ensure the continued relevance of linguistic, or let me rather say expressive, inquiry.
One of the major fields of studies I think literature will be very compatible with is sociology. This is because literature helps us to understand our society very, very well through certain theories that are linked to sociology. I have always been against those who find literature as art for art's sake. That is the new critics and the formalists who believe that literature should be read in complete isolation from society. I have always advocated that literature cannot be separated from the society. Literature defines the society. Literature helps us to understand the society. There are certain theories, mostly associated with sociology, that helps us to understand this, like the theory of Marxism. It provides us the enabling environment to understand the oppression and the subjection that we experience, especially here in Africa. So, sociology is still the number one partner for literature, if I would say, because a theory like Marxism, of course, it touches across different fields, but I think it's more in sociology. So, that alone is enough reason why literature should interact with sociology more, because Marxism helps to expose those oppressive tendencies in the society through literature. If you look at African literature, most times it's majorly protest in nature. It's majorly a literature founded on the proletarian ideology. So it's a literature of struggle. Beginning from the first generation to the contemporary authors we have, their literature is majorly protest in nature. So sociology, again, I'll say, is the major friend literature should have.
I think this is happening already, but I would like to see more porous borders between, say, literature and anthropology. I am a field worker and I often find myself engaging deeply with anthropological studies in the communities I work with. I also find that these two disciplines share key research methodologies, ethnography, for example. And so for me, anthropology looks like a cool partner.
For me, Afrikanistik, I actually don't know how to understand the difference between field and discipline, because for me, Afrikanistik sounds like a department or kind of a discipline, at least in a higher education institution, which shares quite a lot of similarities with disciplines. And then I think the most problematic about Afrikanistik is because actually African languages have a lot of languages under it, but it's so different from like English department or German department or French department, which actually single out one language as a kind of a discipline, which actually renders the Afrikanistik into a kind of area studies, which I think it has already shared a lot of borders with. And another thing is, I think Afrikanistik in Germany has a different historical lineage since it was, I think, started by Mannhof, and then I think it also was housed actually under Oriental studies. So at that time, their focus on languages and culture were actually part of the colonial imperial project. And then how to really think of Afrikanistik in the present as a discipline and how to justify it as a discipline. Actually, very dubious about it. And another thing is, even though it shares similarities with the area studies in the US, but then area studies actually were kind of started in the Cold War era. And the areas that was divided or studied, which become an object of knowledge, are actually the areas mostly of the Third World, and also, of course, the Soviet. So in this sense, there is a kind of knowledge production of the West studying the rest of the world, also embedded in an ideological leaning. So in this sense, I really don't know how to think of African languages and literature as a discipline. Because like other departments as philosophy, history, or sociology, or anthropology, actually all the methods or some theories from these departments have been used in the studies of African literatures and languages. But then why there is always a kind of modifier of it as like African languages instead of just Swahili department or Hausa department and something like this?
For me, the field of African language literature has always been porous. People like me working on verbal arts in non-Western languages do not easily fit into literary studies because most of my research is not done by reading a novel in a printed book, but rather by recording performances or transliterating manuscripts in Arabic script. And I essentially depend on local experts and scholars to explain words to me, and interpretation of text is very often rather a joint work, a kind of collaboration. So for scholars in literary studies like French or English literature, I'm an anthropologist because I do fieldwork. And for the anthropologist, however, I'm a linguist because I'm constantly concerned with languages and texts. And for the linguist, I'm in literary studies because I do not write grammars or analyze language data. Well, I'm not really unhappy about being a linguist, an anthropologist, and a literary scholar, and none of those at the same time, because I think it's an ideal combination. So the linguists give me the vocabulary to talk about the richness of language structure, the semantics and the practices of African languages. So for instance, the way you can endlessly create new verbs in Bantu languages, or you can play with tone in Yoruba, or you can express grammatical subtleties with vowel changes in Somali, and so on and so forth. But there's something lacking in linguistics, which literary studies brings in, and this puts an emphasis on the subtlety and the opaque and the poetic nature of non-propositional language. There is the depth of imagery and metaphors and sound where one has to listen in carefully. This is a language that evokes and that cannot easily be pinned down to just one message. As a kind of poetics or aesthetics of texts, which actually requires a very slow and close and careful reading and rereading and rereading. And that's, of course, also why it's so tightly linked with people's imaginations and also very culturally specific concepts, which one has to examine carefully. And this brings me also to anthropology, because the anthropology I like is a kind of anthropology that does not believe so much in forms of institutions and structures, which some anthropology does. And it's also not an anthropology that objectifies people or looks down on them, but rather it's an anthropology that watches out carefully how literary practices play a role in people's lives and their context. So why and how do people write or sing or compose? How do they talk about and refer to texts in the broadest sense? And what do they mean in their lives? How do they relate to notions of personhood, to people's aspirations, for instance, as well? And rather than already knowing the message and the relevance of texts, it's this kind of anthropology that also requires from us a very careful and a searching examination in fieldwork, and to also question the very vocabulary we have to talk about literary texts and stylistics, but also about people's lives. So I was surprised, for instance, to see how poets in northern Kenya have a very refined notion to talk about poetic meter in terms of their own breath. I saw also how seemingly non-political love poetry can create moments of freedom for women in poor areas of Dar es Salaam. I was fascinated how poets can actually recite poetry about World War I for a whole night in northern Mozambique, and people would not get tired listening to it. These are moments where I, so to say, saw different dimensions, very specific dimensions of poetry in specific moments. And it's this kind of anthropological, let's say, perspective that I like, because it takes time to understand and to share moments and texts with people. It looks out for the subtleties, and what is, I think, extremely important, it takes the other and the aesthetic preferences of another culture seriously. So a folktale is not merely a not yet novel. Rather, we lack the vocabulary to describe it. That's something we have to admit, and we have to make an effort to understand. I like the way this kind of anthropology can unsettle and relativize our categories, similarly in a way to philosophy, but rooted in the everyday, as well as the specific textual and cultural traditions of people. So why should the novel be the prime genre of literature? It has just been there for roughly 100 years in Africa, and there are many more genres. And this brings me to another important discipline for me, and that is history. Our presentism in lots of analysis is a problem because we cannot understand the present through the present only. And our view on verbal creativity, which is the property of all humankind, is so limited if we just look at literature that started in the 1960s with nation building in Africa, or that started during colonialism, and that started with European languages only. Africa has a much longer, broader tradition, and also even parallel in the present, there are many more forms of verbal creativity. And in this respect, I also find the exchange with other philologists, scholars working on non-European languages like Indian languages, on Chinese, on Southern American languages, but also on medieval and early modern Europe, very inspiring, because rather than adding to the notion of a narrow Western-centered planet, they add to a view on literary diversity and open up a broader world of historical depth, which Africa is just equally part of.
Used to pushing the economy. Hail Mama Ghana, God make us braver. Give us the spirit of something so we can be stronger. Red, gold, green, and we sealed it with black stars. So sing along with me if you know you're proud of Ghana. Get proud, I love my home. We God gifted, we have the gold. Peace and harmony, we have it all. Let me show you where I'm from. Live free Ghana, I'm black and proud. Live free Ghana, so say it loud. Live free Ghana. Malak with me free Ghana. Turn it, get me free Ghana. Okay, yampon kwame ensa yao. Osrone asase ya ensa yao. Nana no mo saman for ensa yao. Yenyi Ghana juma pa ye.